And to Ukraine now, where President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has urged his country to prepare for a new wave of Russian airstrikes. As long as they have rockets, they won't rest, Zelenskyy said in a video address referring to Russia's military and its attacks on critical infrastructure. There's been no Russian response to his claims. Last week, intensified Russian strikes subjected Ukrainians to the most acute power cuts since the war began. As of Sunday, millions in and around the capital Kyiv still had little electricity or heat amid freezing temperatures. Now, Marysia Sapashnik is the head of the humanitarian aid organization International Rescue Committee in Ukraine, and she joins me from Vinnytsia in central Ukraine. Marysia, what is life like for the millions of Ukrainians facing constant power outages, water and heat disruptions due to these Russian attacks?
Thank you very much for having me. Yes, the situation on the ground here in Ukraine is incredibly concerning and alarming as a result, as you said, of these attacks on civilian infrastructure and on the civilian power grid. Millions of people throughout the country, not just around Kyiv, but also in the east and southeast, are without power, without electricity, without water and without heating. And in the most affected areas, in the east and in the southeast, many people have been without these services already for months. Winter has arrived, temperatures are below zero, we've seen the first snowfall, and temperatures are expected to drop to -20 degrees in some parts of the country. And it's important to remember that winter lasts until March here in Ukraine, so we still have another 5.5 months of bitterly cold weather ahead of us. Now, the UN estimates that there are already 6.5 million people internally displaced within Ukraine. And without power or heating, we fear that there could be another huge displacement of people as people leave their homes in search of warmth or safety.
Now, last week, President Zelenskyy has actually criticized the mayor of Kyiv, saying he wasn't doing enough to help people. Are authorities, local authorities, overwhelmed by this situation?
Well, yes, the biggest problem here is the continued attacks on civilians and on civilian infrastructure, the civilian power grid and heating systems. I think the estimate now is that about 50% of the power grid and heating stations have been damaged. And with each new attack, the percentage grows and their blackouts are likely to be longer and more widespread. The authorities and the suppliers are trying their very best to reconnect people as quickly as possible, but the strain on the system is really huge. To give you an example, yesterday when I was walking, not in Vinnytsia, I'm in Dnipro actually, and walking yesterday on the streets, complete darkness, no street lighting, very few lights in the windows. The sun goes down here about 3:30 in the afternoon already. I've seen people queuing for water, people queuing to charge their phones. Now, having a charged phone is important to stay in contact with family members, but also to receive important safety information from the authorities.
Now, millions of Ukrainians have already fled the war, and you mentioned them earlier. Do you think that the Russian attacks on this critical infrastructure will lead to many more people leaving the country?
Well, yes, that is one of the main concerns of the humanitarian community at the moment. As I mentioned, 6.5 million people are displaced within the country, but without power or heating, there could be many more people. It's incredibly hard to estimate how many people that could be who may be forced to leave their homes in search of warmth and safety, and whether that means moving to other parts of Ukraine or whether it means crossing the border into neighboring countries, it's very difficult to tell. But the priority of the humanitarians here in country remains timely and critical assistance, and we're committed to stay and deliver the essential and vital services that people here need on the ground.
Marysia Sapashnik with the International Rescue Committee in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, fighting is far from over in the southern city of Kherson. Though it's back under Ukrainian control, Russian forces continue to shell the city from across the Dnipro River. At the same time, people there are coming to grips with the past 8 months of Russian occupation. DW's correspondent Nick Connolly met with 2 residents who survived weeks of torture. Warning, some viewers might find the descriptions of violence in this report upsetting.
Queuing for food, huddling around the few working Wi-Fi hotspots. Carrying on in spite of the shelling all around them. This is what everyday life looks like in Kherson. The government in Kyiv wants people to evacuate to areas with power and water, away from the Russian guns. Daniil and Victoria stayed put during 8 long months of Russian occupation, and they're not about to go anywhere now. They might seem like old friends, but they only met in September in the cellar of this unremarkable office block as prisoners.
They forced their way into our flat and my grandma started screaming. They let her off into the bathroom. Soon I had a bag over my head and they just started beating me over and over. Who's your president? Who's your president? You're coming with us. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Daniil had subscribed to a pro-Ukrainian chat group on Telegram. Enough for Kherson's increasingly anxious Russian occupiers to come after him. Victoria had been volunteering, taking food to people in need when her group came under suspicion for contacts in government-controlled territory. When the Russians raided her home, they found Ukrainian flags, army souvenirs and postcards.
I guess that means you're our enemy, doesn't it? The interrogator asked me. I agreed with him. But what do people do to their enemies, he asked. They kill them, I replied. You're right, he said, but they torture them first. I didn't think I'd get out of there alive.
Victoria and Daniil had no idea where it was they'd been kept. They only realised they'd spent all those weeks in the middle of Kherson when they recognised pictures of their basement shared online. We tried to go inside, but the police isn't letting anyone in. The risk of Russian mines is just too high. All Daniil and Victoria ever saw was their cell. As soon as they left it, they were kept in hoods, their captors determined to remain unseen. But as little as they could see, they could hear more than they wanted to.
The worst was hearing your screams.
I was the loudest in our basement during the interrogations.
All the cells could hear you yelping. It was unbearable. The men's shouts didn't travel quite as far, but when you started, all I could do was pray that they'd go easy on you.
At my last interrogation, my hands were bound. The pain from the electric shocks was so bad that I didn't even notice that I'd pulled a nail out. All of a sudden, I could feel the blood dripping. My hands, my trousers, they were all covered in blood.
But the most terrifying moment was still to come. After weeks without news, all the inmates were suddenly driven out of the city, their guards telling them it was time to say their prayers.
They made everyone record a short video. You had to say your name, your date of birth, and say into the camera that you were alive and well. For a moment, I was really worried. What do they need this for? Did they need an alibi?
They were told to close their eyes and count to 100. But instead of the shots they'd expected, they heard their captors driving away without them. The likelihood their Russian captors will ever face justice is slim. They torched all the evidence as they left. But at least one good thing has come of it all, Victoria tells me. We're done being scared.
With an increasing number of Russian attacks on Ukraine's infrastructure, many European countries are preparing for another influx of Ukrainian refugees. The city of Berlin, for example, has taken in nearly 90,000 refugees from Ukraine this year. And it's working on more accommodation, including huge tent facilities at a former airport here. Local church communities are also stepping in to help.
It was supposed to be emergency accommodation, but for around 30 Ukrainian refugees, this is home now. The community hall of the Marcus congregation in Berlin. The church pays for the refugees' stay here. Finding a permanent apartment in Berlin is almost impossible. Anna Zhuravskaya and her 8-year-old daughter Anastasia found a room for a few months. Now they had to come back. They say the dormitory almost feels like home. Anna fled with her 2 children from Odessa back in March.
I was so scared when people in Ukraine said, "You need to leave, save your children." I was so scared to go to a foreign country where I don't know the language, the people, the mentality. But here we've been treated so warmly.
The volunteers here have been so dedicated to helping the Ukrainian refugees that the church has employed some of them to sort through donations and groceries and help translate. Several are originally from Russia, but here it's support in hard times that counts rather than national boundaries. And the volunteers expect a tough winter.
Wir haben Kapazitäten bis 80 Personen.
We have space for 80 people here, or for 100 in case of a crisis. I think we're ready. We will give our all to help these people and take them in. Definitely.
Auf jeden Fall, auf jeden Fall.
With winter setting in, Berlin's government is in a race against time, for example, at this former airport. Currently, new arrivals from Ukraine register and live here temporarily before they can be moved on, within Berlin or to other German cities. 2 heated tents at the old airport house 400 people each, but they're almost full. By the end of the year, the city plans to set up more permanent housing for an additional 10,000 refugees.
Our goal is for people's stay in this temporary housing to be short, so that we can offer people a place to move on to. But at the moment, people have been arriving faster than we can create places for them.
Back at the Marcus church community, one Ukrainian family has been able to move into a permanent separate apartment after months in a tiny room with 2 infants. Their mother, Yulia, is relieved, but feeling fully at home can be hard. Many of the family's relatives are still in Ukraine.
We are living here in peace and quiet, in a warm, nice place, and they are there. We still feel like we are somehow in limbo. But I am trying to live in the current reality. I'm living here with the kids, and I have to create a comfortable life for them.
With the war dragging on and winter ahead, Yulia's family is lucky. Even now, hundreds of Ukrainians are stuck in arrival centers in Berlin, hoping for a more permanent home.